You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi everyone, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. This episode is a discussion about a very interesting video that Daniel Mackler made. And I will put a link to this video in the show notes, but you can also find it on YouTube. It's called Are You Ready to Have Children? Challenging Questions for Prospective Parents. And it's by Daniel Mackler. His surname is Mackler. So you can find it on YouTube or just click on the link. I think it's a really interesting video. I don't agree with everything in it, but it's really thought-provoking. And this is a discussion that I had with Stephanie Murphy on a patron-only live stream recently. So I hope you find this interesting, and without further delay, here's our discussion.
So I guess to give a synopsis of the video, it's linked in the Voluntary Life Facebook group, but it was a video by Daniel Mackler, who is pretty, I would say, well-known for a couple of different things, but one of his main shticks, I guess, is talking about readiness to have children. And I think in the past, a lot of people have criticized him because he basically comes to the conclusion that pretty much no one is really ready to have children, even though a lot of people do, obviously.
Yeah.
And so this video was along those same lines. He was going through a list of that he thought indicate that someone is ready to have children. And I don't remember all of the criteria, but some of them were questions like, how are your finances? How is your sleep? Are you dealing with nightmares and not sleeping on a regular basis? Because that could get hairy with children. Obviously, they make it more difficult to sleep. How's your relationship with your partner? How is your own emotional health? Do you have a lot of unresolved trauma? Are you emotionally needy, meaning you're having children with the expectation that your children meet your emotional needs by giving you love or affection or whatever? And then he got into some other stuff. How old are you? You shouldn't be too young, but you shouldn't be too old. Do you have good genes, quote unquote? Are you going to pass on a genetic disease to your children? Then he got into, do you live in a city? Are you going to be able to live in the same place for your child's entire childhood, like until they're grown up? Are you going to be reasonably certain that you are going to live until your child is at least, 20 years old? And it was really interesting how many different criteria he laid out. Now, I thought that everything he brought up was a great point. So, I'm not criticizing him or anything like that. I thought that from the perspective of an unborn child, advocating for the ideal kind of childhood, he was raising excellent points. Like, of course, we would all like to be born into that ideal situation where we live in the suburbs, we can play in the fresh air and trees, and our parents love each other and are both emotionally healthy, and they're parenting with their best friend who they're in love with and can model a healthy relationship, and all this other, they have their finances stable, they have enough time to spend with a kid. Oh, another criteria that he listed, which I thought was interesting, was how is your rapport with children, basically? Do children naturally gravitate towards you?
I thought that was fascinating. Like yeah. And he makes, on that one, he made a really good point, which is that, if you don't have much of a rapport with children, if children don't want to hang out with you, then it's not a good idea to have kids. And his observation was that sometimes people who don't have a rapport with kids have kids because they know they're going to have a kind of captive audience, that their kid is going to have to like them in a sense because it'll be their kid dependent on them. But the point being is, do you actually have a natural rapport? Do kids have fun with you, basically?
Yeah, he said children have a very good radar for picking out who is like an authentic person and who is fake and who is real, I think is what he said. And yeah, I liked that he brought up that point, because certainly there are a lot of those types of people who aren't very playful, I guess, or they seem very adult-like as opposed to childlike, having fun, having a lot of energy, getting down on the ground and playing around. And kids don't tend to gravitate towards those people, but a lot of those people do have kids at the same time.
Yeah. You have to be willing to let your guard down and be potentially in a situation where you might make a fool of yourself and be silly and not have the kind of adult gravitas to have fun with kids. And for some people, I think that is, they've got too much of a defense around them to do that. And kids can smell that, you know, they can really sense that. And that's, I think, what he was sort of getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. And even with some of those people who are parents, he mentioned in the beginning of the video, like just basically the physical and emotional stress that parenting can put on people. And one of the things about that he said was like, being a parent can be boring. It can be not very intellectually stimulating, especially when the kids are young. It can be socially isolating if you're spending a ton of time with your kid and not with anybody else really, because you don't have a lot of time for other things. I thought those were all really good points. And I've seen a lot of people become parents and just get really worn down by the tiredness, the lack of sleep, the social isolation, the lack of intellectual stimulation. And it doesn't seem like they're having as much fun in life, I guess. And that's the kind of person that he described that kids kind of shy away from sometimes. So ironically, you know, you could turn into that kind of person that kids are a little bit wary of through becoming a parent.
Yeah. And I thought one of the things the points that he made is, how much experience have you got looking after kids and hanging out with kids? Because you got to consider this like a job. And for a major job, an employer is going to want to know, do you actually have any experience in this field? And I can't remember the exact wording he used, but he was making the point that this is the most important job you're going to have in life.
Yeah, I knew you would like that point, Jake, because he was relating it to almost like a venture, you know. And most employers are not going to want to hire somebody who doesn't have any experience in the chosen field that they're working with. But, you know, you're not required to get hired or interviewed as a parent before you become a parent. But it's almost like your child should be allowed to hire you or to interview you and ask you these questions before they're born almost. Since your unborn child cannot ask you those questions and cannot give you a check-in about how fit you are to be a parent, you're kind of responsible for asking them to yourself before you choose to become a parent. So yeah, I like that he brought that up about the experience with children. So anyway, I think we hit a lot of the criteria that he mentioned, all of which he has written about before, but I hadn't seen too many of his videos before. So it was really interesting to see him speaking about it in his own words and to just hear his demeanor.
Yeah. And I mean, I've got some thoughts about the video, but what did you think? What was your experience of the list, and what did you think about it, sort of thinking about these ideas? And yeah, what did you make of it, basically?
Well, as I was starting to say a little earlier, I thought that all the points he brought up were amazing from the perspective of an unborn child who would want to have the most ideal childhood possible. And they were great, like interview questions for somebody who's becoming a first-time parent. However, if you put all of these criteria together, it starts to form almost an impossible picture, right? You can't be too old, but you can't be too young, but you're also supposed to be like well set with your finances, which a lot of people aren't. You can't really live in a city. You have to be settled somewhere in the suburbs, and that takes finances to afford. And, you know, and you have to be worked on your emotional trauma. People come from all different places, you know, starting off with how much trauma they had in their own childhood and how aware they are of it and how much work it's going to take to get them to a place of greater emotional fitness and how much that's going to cost in terms of therapy or taking time off of work to focus on your own emotional health or whatever. Partnerships too, you know, it takes some people a long time to find the right partner who they might want to reproduce with. And so if there's a biological clock that's ticking in a sense, you know, you don't want to be too old or too young. Genetic diseases, they can happen sporadically. So, you know, it's one thing to sort of knowingly pass on quote unquote bad genes, but we all have little genetic imperfections that we pass on. And what is the threshold for good or bad genes? You know, that was a little black and white to me. But I just want to say that even though I could see people raising all those criticisms and the major criticism being that it's impossible to meet all these criteria, that would be the major criticism that I could hear people making. And for someone who already is a parent, I could see that video might make them feel really guilty and bad and say, oh my gosh, I don't meet any of these criteria, you know, but I already have a kid. So what am I supposed to do now?
I don't match up, but I've already committed. So now I'm really stuck.
Yeah, right. And he didn't really give much in the way of solutions for people who may not meet all those criteria, but already have children. He did say that it's possible to work on your emotional health and your relationship with your partner after you have children, but that it gets a lot harder. And I agree with that. but it was really geared toward people who didn't have any children yet. And it didn't offer much in the way of helpful tips or advice for people who do already have children, but might want to, just become better at parenting or become better at knowing themselves or whatever, personal growth. So that's the major criticism I see. However, I just imagine him getting a ton of hate, for a video like that. I didn't look at the YouTube comments, but I'm sure he gets rage, just horrible trolls from people who it touches a nerve with. So I don't want to blast him too much for it. And I really liked all the points that he brought up. But maybe he's just delivering a harsh truth that most people who have children were not ready to become parents and maybe didn't go about it as they might have thought or they might have ideally liked. And that's one of the reasons why we have a lot of children who grow up into adults who have childhoods that they have to recover from and not childhoods that really nurture them and turn them into outstanding, healthy adults.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I'm coming at this video from the perspective of knowing Daniel and having talked to him about his ideas and having seen a lot more of his more extreme videos and more extreme views expressed in articles and stuff, because I've seen Daniel really say, well, nobody's healthy enough to have kids and nobody has overcome their traumas to an extent to which they can be good parents. Seeing this video, funnily enough, to me, it seemed way more reasonable because it's like he's talking about specific criteria. He's not just like, well, nobody's enlightened enough. And it's because he's said in the past, nobody has reached the level of enlightenment enough to really be a good parent. And I include myself in that, Daniel says, and he indeed hasn't had kids, right? So that always struck me as kind of a little bit silly as a criticism, because it's like, okay, so really when you say that, you don't really help anyone because what are we supposed to do? Just nobody reproduces at all. And I don't believe that. And I do detect in Daniel's general outlook a certain, because he's very interested in environmentalism and he feels that there's too many people, he also has a kind of slightly anti-human approach, which I've talked about in the past, that I don't agree with either. But what I found about this video is that I think he was very specific and he was talking about very clear topics that I think are very helpful questions for people to ask. And I didn't 100% agree with all of his ideas. Like, for example, I don't think you have to be in nature. Daniel, I know, spent much of his childhood in, I think, upstate New York, and he had lots of access to the forest and being able to walk around in nature. And so for him, it's very important, right? Mm-hmm. And I can understand totally that, city environments are definitely not an easy place for kids, but I'm not sure that I really buy that every kid needs to be raised on the edges of town or in nature so much. I think so there are some of them that I'm not 100% sold on. But in general, I thought some of these things that he put forward are just really good things to think about. For example, the point that he made, are you best friends with your partner? And I know that, I have been in relationships in the past where my partner wasn't my best friend. And it's sad and it's a little embarrassing to think of that for myself, to realize, actually I spent quite a lot of time with partners in the past who, if I were honest, they weren't my best friend. We weren't emotionally that close. But I know that, for example, I know without a doubt that Hannah is my best friend. And so I have chosen to have a family with my best friend. And I think that difference is very, very meaningful to me. It makes a huge difference. And I think if I was in my 20s watching this video, I think it would be helpful to think to myself, well, is my partner my best friend? It's a tough question, but there's nothing wrong with experimenting with relationships and trying things out. And obviously, a lot of relationships don't work out, but it's a whole different ballgame if you're going to have kids with that person. And so I think that's a really sensible question to ask oneself. And I just found all of the questions to be really good like that. Personally, speaking for myself, most of those questions I actually feel really good about. My response and our choice to have kids. And there was some in there that I think we also have thought about and that are challenges for us. Like, he makes the point that it's a big difference for a kid being in one place and being able to spend a lot of time and develop friendships and have some stability and so forth. And this is something that Hannah and I have really over the last year, we've really come to understand. I personally think that doesn't kick in for the first few years, because at this point in her life, our daughter is really focused on us and really focused on the family unit. And she's not, she's just not that interested in other kids. And we're not quite there yet. But I think by the time she's 4 or 5, that's a whole different situation. And it's going to be very important for her to have more stability. And so it's something that we're really thinking about. Where do we want to try and provide that stability? And how do we envisage accommodating some aspects of travel in our lifestyle, but probably nothing like what we've been used to, because it's probably not going to work so well for Freya. So I found it to be a very thought-provoking thing. And also it made me kind of sad thinking about it, because I thought about some of the questions that he asked, and I reflected on my own family and my own parents. My parents came from a generation, and this is actually not just my parents. I'm particularly thinking about some of my cousins and just generally my wider extended family. My parents came from a generation who were sort of hippies. And, one thing he says is, look, if you want to have affairs with other people, you probably are not in a state of mind where you're really ready to make a family, and your energy is just directed elsewhere. And I think that is the experience, certainly, that my parents' generation had. And I think it was really bad news. And he makes the point in there that if that's the case, you may not be staying together that long with your partner. If you're looking for an affair, then you may not be there may not be much of a future in your relationship. So why would you be having a kid? And of course, most of my friends and cousins and relatives had parents who broke up. And I think that's really tough on the kids. So it made me sad to think about. Also, I know friends in my own generation who've had kids and have broken up, and they're trying to work out the whole shared custody thing. And it's just a nightmare, it's a nightmare. So it made me sad to think about it. But I hope that it's also something that for people who really genuinely want to be good parents, this is a useful list. It's a challenging list, but it's a useful list to confront yourself with,
Yeah, absolutely. And it is also useful to think about it from the perspective of how would your own parents have answered all those questions? And did they even attempt to ask any of those questions before they created you?
Right. Exactly. To what extent did my own parents really work out their own perspective on their own childhoods and critically look at the way that they were raised and try and think about what issues they had left over from their childhoods? Well, frankly, I think my parents could have done a hell of a lot more in that respect. They really could have done. And I think a lot of people could stand to do a lot more reassessment of their own childhoods and really thinking about it and just being conscious of what their view is, actually having a kind of retrospective look back at their own childhoods and coming to some conclusions about the whole thing. So I thought that was interesting. I do know what you mean about when you go through this list, you could get to the end and say, oh, for heaven's sake, this is like now this is just an impossible list. And I thought he was actually kind of careful to leave a lot open to interpretation. For example, he makes the point, it's not a great idea to have kids when you're too young, when you're immature, when you're not yet sort of mentally ready for such a huge project. But on the other hand, it's not a good idea to have kids when you're too old. But he doesn't really give a cut-off date. And the example that he gave was, he said something like, I see guys having kids in their 50s and 60s, and sometimes even in their 70s. And I got to say, they're not going to be around for that long. And I think that is a very fair comment. A lot of these rock stars who have kids when they're in their 60s and stuff, it's like, well, you're not going to be there for that much of your child's life. And that's pretty tough.
Right. Yeah. And then who are they depending on to be the other parent? Right.
And I'm sure there are a lot of rich guys who can provide for their kids, even if they do die before their kids are grown up. But that's sort of not the point. The point that he's making is the emotional burden of having your parents die when you're young is really tough for kids. Even if it's a rock star who's obviously left a lot of money or whatever, it's really tough. So I think that is definitely something that is going to potentially give the kid a real burden to deal with. I mean, obviously nobody can help it, and we're all mortal, and we can't control stuff that we don't know about. Like it's possible for any of us to die way before we expect to. But I think if you're in, like your 60s, right, then it's a different set of probabilities that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the other thing is I saw sort of a conflict between, I guess, the financial pieces of that. And, well, I saw a conflict between a couple of things. For some people, they really don't reach financial independence until their late 30s or 40s, perhaps. And a lot of people say, for women, that's too old to be having children. Your risk of chromosomal abnormalities goes up by that point, but it takes a lot of people until that age to find financial independence. Also, getting out of debt. He said basically don't have kids if you're in debt, but how are you going to live in the suburbs without a mortgage, right?
Yeah.
So I could see people having a really hard time reconciling those things. And I mean, everybody's situation is different, but yeah, I mean, I agree that is a challenge. That is a challenge for a lot of people, and women, constantly hear about that, right? Oh, you got to have kids before you're 30 or before you've missed your window. Yeah, I think there is a lot of pressure on women to have kids when they're, not too old, but also not too young, because you don't want to be a pregnant teenager and people are all constantly judging the age at which women choose to have children. Whether or not they choose to have children is another thing that people get judged for. Oh, she has too many kids. She doesn't have enough kids. She doesn't have any kids, So yeah. There is a ton of pressure, especially on women. I know men get it too, but especially on women, because there are these ideas about the biological clock and the age of the eggs and the ovaries. And that part of that is a biological fact, because females are born with a certain number of eggs that don't really renew over their lifetime, and they sort of just, count down until menopause. Men can renew their sperm from stem cells at pretty much any age. So although the likelihood of chromosomal abnormalities from an older father, a father of advanced age, is higher as well. It's not only dependent on the mother's age. So there is a little bit of a difference there. But, I think we're going to see technologies come out in the next couple of decades that can prevent menopause and that can restore basically reproductive capacity to older women than is currently available with the current technology. Fertility technologies have already opened up more options for older people having kids, or for people who thought they couldn't reproduce for whatever reason, being able to have children. And I think that's just going to continue. And then we're going to have to contend with the issue of, okay, well, if the mother is in her late 40s or 50s or 60s, are we going to see women in their 60s having children? And that's an interesting thing to think about.
Totally. It could get really interesting in our lifetimes if longevity does increase as much as some people think it will do. I think
if fertility age increases, I would expect there also to be an increase in the average lifespan or health span or age of longevity. I'm personally really interested in life extension technologies. And so a lot of people who are interested in those kinds of technologies are also interested in fertility in extending technologies as well. So I follow it kind of closely, and I have a science background. I'm a biochemist. So I follow all that stuff really closely, but it definitely makes me think about societal issues. I mean, personally, just a little personal thing, I have chosen not to have children. I'm a female in my 30s, early 30s. And, I kind of doubt that that's going to change before my natural reproductive window closes. Part of the reason for that is there's multiple reasons, but I just basically have a lot of other things I'd rather do with my life than parenting. But I've thought about, like, if I could have a child when I was 60, would I? Maybe. I think I said that to you once, Jake, and you were kind of surprised.
Yeah.
I guess I wouldn't rule it out as much as having a child now.
Right. Listening to this video of his list, did it make you reflect on your own choice? Did it bring up any thoughts or feelings for you about your choice?
Yeah, well, I would say it made me reflect on my own childhood a lot and how my parents would have answered those questions.
Right.
And I will say that although my parents weren't perfect, nobody is perfect, they got a lot right in how they went about things. They were together in a stable relationship. They were best friends in love. They kept me in a stable location throughout my whole childhood. I don't know that I took advantage of it because I don't have any childhood friends that I still keep in touch with, but it was a stable environment with lots of trees and places outside to run around. And I definitely appreciated that. And, they provided me with a largely awesome childhood. And of course, nothing's perfect again, but I'm proud of my parents and how much they got right. So I'm really grateful for that. And as far as my own choice, not to have children, I guess I found it validating in a lot of ways to watch the video, because Daniel was saying, like, look, having kids, especially young children, can be very socially isolating, kind of boring. You do need social support, like people that you can count on to help you with this, because it's a big job. And sometimes for two parents, they will get exhausted or frustrated or taxed, I guess, emotionally taxed. It can put a strain on relationships and a strain on time. And I just said, yeah, I agree with all that. And I see it in other parents. I see it all the time in other parents. They're just stressed out. And of course they're stressed out because it's a big job. It's a really big undertaking. And especially if they're trying to work or do other projects, there's often just not enough hours in the day. I'm a person who needs a lot of sleep. I actually quit medical school partly because I knew I wouldn't be able to handle all the shift work and overnight work. I just think that with the other things that I want to do and how I want my lifestyle to be and the quality of sleep that I prefer, and also just the time that I like to spend with my partner, I think that having a child would strain all of those things, and I'd prefer to just focus on the things that I already have going that I enjoy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think my experience of the video is that this is an important thing for people to confront themselves with who have a very romanticized view of what having kids is like. And what you have is a far more realistic view, and you have looked at it and said, look, I understand the costs associated with this project or this massive undertaking, and I've made the choice for myself that I don't want to pay those costs because I'm taking this realistic view. And I think there are some people who have a very rosy view of, I'm going to have this loving little person who's just going to think I'm really wonderful and give me all of this back. And this is another good point that he made, by the way, in the video for people who haven't seen it yet, that he makes the point that people have kids to fulfill their own needs, when that's not what you should be doing with kids. And the purpose of a child is not to fulfill the parent's emotional need. They're very needy. They have needs themselves. And so
I like the way he put that. He said that children are born filled with needs, and because they depend on their parents for survival, they cannot help but try to meet the parent's needs if the parent has unfulfilled needs that they're expecting the child to meet. But that's not an ideally healthy situation for a child to be sort of born into this demand or request that the child meet the parents' needs, when it actually really needs to be the other way around.
Totally. And so this is a great list for people who've got a rosy, romantic view of kids. My experience is, I think that because both Hannah and I did a lot of self-work and self-knowledge work before having kids, I think we actually had almost an overly pessimistic view of the challenge that we faced, right? And the interesting thing is when if you try and be realistic about what having a kid is going to be like, and okay, I know this is going to involve some real psychological challenges. I'm going to have to make sure that my buttons are not pressed and that I really have worked on myself. And I know that it's going to be physically challenging and lack of sleep. And I think we had got ourselves into this mentality that we were sort of like getting ready to do this ultra marathon, sort of really grueling.
You're preparing for an uphill battle.
Right.
But it wasn't that bad.
No, and the great thing is if you have a much more realistic view of the costs of having kids, then you might have the experience, or people might have the experience that we had, which is this has been so much more fun than we anticipated. We actually thought that these years were going to be really hard years. You just got to make sure that you don't let your buttons get pushed and all of that. But actually, we're just having a great time. We're really loving it. And that, I think, is partly because we were not overly rosy in our thinking about what having a kid was going to be like. We really were ready for it to be really difficult. And actually, as it turns out, and we're just very lucky because Freya's just a very easygoing, lovely person. And so so far, we're just having a wonderful time. So that I think is
that's so great to hear. I'm really happy for you. And I do think that you two, I saw you go about the process of like deciding to become parents, and I think you get a gold star, right? You went about it really consciously, and I'm super glad you're having a great experience. And it makes me happy. And actually, speaking of how I viewed, I guess, kids, or how, like, did I have an optimistic or pessimistic view of it? I actually did spend a ton of time with children when I was a teenager. I did a lot of babysitting, and then over time, I guess didn't interact with kids so much in my early 20s, but over time, my peers began having kids and I started interacting with them, and I started getting interested in healing from childhood trauma and that kind of stuff. And so was exposed to those issues and thinking about them a ton. Yeah, I mean, it's just really interesting to observe parents and children in the wild and see how they interact with each other, and also compare it to parents and children where the parents have gone about having children way more consciously and things are a lot easier for everyone involved.
Yeah. Thanks for that. And I wanted to mention one other thing about my experience of that video, because I feel in general, I do feel really good about the choices that we've made, and watching the video wasn't that challenging in a lot of the respects, because a lot of the things were like, yep, okay, we've done pretty well, I think, in getting ready for having kids, and we've addressed these questions already. Having said that, I will say that I know that some of the criteria that Daniel outlines, I wouldn't be ideal in his terms. For example, I am in my mid-40s, and for Daniel, I think that probably, he didn't say it in this video, but I know that he thinks that's too old to have kids. For me, the interesting thing is to look at these criteria and say, what's my response to this question about being ready to have kids? And for example, I know that I am older than a lot of dads who have kids who have more energy from youth and they're more able to have that energy because they're younger than me. So I consider it an important responsibility for myself to stay in shape. I mean, I just think that that's important, not only for my own health, but because I really need to be on my game to be able to actually keep up with the demands of being a father. And so I think I consider it to be, it's a challenging question for me because, I probably am older than it would ideally be to be having kids. I know that, for example, the lack of sleep would be way easier if I was 15 years younger when I had kids. But I know that I also benefit from many of the things that I wouldn't have if I wasn't this old, like the financial security and the other things. So I take on board that feedback in that video and think, so for me personally, there is a challenge. I'm a bit older, and that means I need to really stay in shape because it's important, and it's important to have enough energy and so forth. So it's still challenging for me, some of these things, and some of them I think everyone has to decide for themselves, like, okay, maybe I don't fit the criteria that Daniel Mackler has outlined, but I'm thinking about the issue and I'm working out what my approach to that problem is going to be. And if you take the video in those terms, for people who are interested in this video as a challenge to themselves, if they're thinking of having kids, even if you find one of the questions to be particularly challenging because you're like, ooh, I don't fit the profile that he's outlining there, I think you can still say, okay, so what am I going to do about it? How would I overcome some of what could be potentially a downside for kids from me as a parent? What am I going to do to overcome that now?
Yeah, absolutely. I like looking at it in those terms. I was sort of thinking, like, if you could get maybe 80 or 90% of the way there based on what his criteria were that were laid out, and have strategies at least in place to deal with the other 20% or 10% that you couldn't meet. Well, I think that's great. I mean, like I said, the one about living in one place, I think it benefited me as a child, for example, but having the same friends, okay, but I'm not friends with any of my childhood friends now. So was that really that useful? Like, could my parents have maybe afforded to move a little bit more? Yeah, maybe it probably wouldn't have impacted me too badly because a lot of other things were in place that were very healthy. Obviously, nothing's ever 100% perfect or ideal, but he did a good job coming from the position of what we would all want if we could choose before we were born. Would you rather have parents that did this or did that? And, he's sort of laying out the ideal. And if we feel that we can get reflect on those questions and get closer to the ideal, I think he would consider that a win.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said before, I found it a way more constructive approach than some of the other videos that he's done about this topic, because I think these questions aren't pie in the sky unrealistic, and they're not going to leave someone thinking, oh, well, I'll never be able to have kids then. Because if you do find it challenging to hear him talking about something like having debt and that being a challenge if you want to have kids, then you can at least say, okay, well, I've got some debt and I really want to have kids. So what am I going to do about it? What's my plan? And at least you can have a strategy in place and work out like what you're doing, rather than stumbling into it and being romantic about the idea of having kids and then realizing, oh my God, I can't afford this and I'm in debt and this is so stressful and stuff. So I really recommend this video for anyone who's thinking about the idea of having kids, because I think it is a constructive thing to take a look at.
Yeah, I recommend it too. I thought it was great. And I wonder if Daniel got feedback on his previous approach and changed it based on that, or if he was just sort of like, maybe he had the same ideas in mind, but he was trying to take more of a therapist approach and just ask questions, like leading questions perhaps, and not be prescriptive as much as he was in the past. I don't know. I'd be curious to ask him about that, if he had gotten some feedback or why he decided to like sort of change the tone or the way he presented the same message.
Yeah, I would be very curious to hear what his response to that would be as well. If I had to guess, my guess would be that Daniel has, he's put a message out there, which has been a very campaigning message to basically say, stop having kids if you're emotionally all messed up yourself, because you're going to mess up your own kids and it's really unjust on children.
And P.S. everyone is emotionally messed up.
Right. And you're right. And as far as I'm concerned, Daniel says, you're all emotionally messed up. And I'm guessing that what's happened is that he's reflected on this and said, well, what's my goal here? My goal is to protect children and stop them from being abused by parents. What can I most effectively do to try and reduce the amount of abuse? Well, at least I can try and get parents to think about this and try and get them to take a more constructive approach. And so if I had to guess, I'm guessing that he still probably holds a lot of those views that he had, but he's trying to do something that is more of an outreach to parents or prospective parents that they can actually at least do something constructive and positive with. And in that respect, I think this is a much more positive and potentially constructive thing to do than his previous videos.
Yeah, I liked it too.
Awesome.
So everybody out there, if you're interested, Jake and I both recommend giving it a watch.
Exactly.
Definitely will provoke some thoughts for you.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I really enjoyed that chat, and we've got to about an hour, so I think we'll wrap it up here. Thank you so much for coming on, both of you. It's been great fun chatting, and let's do it again.
Thank you for listening to The Voluntary Life. If you like this podcast, please show your support by becoming a patron of The Voluntary Life on Patreon. Your support will help to grow and improve the show, and you'll get access to a treasure trove of rewards, including bonus episodes. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to learn more.